Sitting immediately to my right is Mark Gelfo, 29 years with TLC, 5.5 years as a principal. Mark's specialty is electrical engineering, commissioning, energy auditing, performance verification, and sustainability with high performance design practices. Mark serves on the board of directors of ACG, the EM, the Avengers, and is the past vice chair of USGBC National Lead Implementation Advisory Committee. That's Mark. Directly to the right of Mark is Jim Magee. Jim, one of the commissioning industry's leading advocates, has been a past president of ACG as well as a co-author of the original ACG commissioning guideline and instrumental in development of the new revised guideline, which we most of us were in that room, and Jim and Dan did a very good job. We're excited about that work. Jim is the president of Facility Commissioning Group. He is also a lead AP energy management professional.
I'm principal, not president anymore, sorry.
Oh, okay. Principal. Directly to the right of Jim is Peter Turek. Peter is an operations and maintenance first person and a senior commissioning provider for TLC, Engineering Solutions. Peter's road to commissioning has not been the typical road. That course he went on was primarily through architecture, drafting studies before attending a maritime academy and passing the United States Coast Guard examination for steam and diesel operation of unlimited horsepower propulsion plants. So that's a lot. Just a little, we asked each other to write our intros. So if I were to say that all in a different way, Peter is licensed as a POE by 3 separate organizations and worked on diesel freighters with pistons the diameter of dinner tables and fuel injectors the size of Herschel Walker's calves. Peter has over 18 years of O&M experience and 16 plus years experience providing commissioning services, and is an active member of ACG Building Systems Guideline Committee, holding a CXA, EMP, and Lead AP certifications. Charles, directly to the right of Peter, is a commissioning team manager for Sustainable Building Partners in Fairfax, Virginia, with more than 15 years experience commissioning electrical power systems and mission critical facilities. A graduate of Drexel University, Charles likes to spend his free time playing basketball, boxing, traveling, reading, and serves on the board of ACG Board of Directors, where he has been instrumental as a part of the team developing the new guideline. Charles is a registered PE, a certified energy manager, and ACG certified CXA. Did I get all that right? All right. These first initial slides are mandatory. You've seen them. You're going to see them again throughout the day. And we're going to try to jump straight into questions so we can have time at the end. Again, apologize for the title. I'm trying to be inclusive on the subject. But if I'm going to boil down the concern, the topic, it's NETA NETA certification being required for commissioning providers. What do we do? How do we satisfy that? Who's asking for it, and why are they asking for it? Maybe we can't answer all that today, but we'll try. So I'm just going to kind of cruise over these learning objectives. These PowerPoints are available to everybody. So let's get into it. Why are we talking about this today? You know, it's okay to say, well, that's one client, right? What does it matter what one client has this requirement for? Why do I care? Well, this one client happens to be the U.S. government. They're fairly large, and we get a lot of work from them. All that said, regardless of their size, a trend, if we're to believe the past, is that the private sector is influenced by the Fed. So although this may not be a new requirement, relatively new to our industry, it's been out for a bit, and in the last few years has becoming more difficult to address with questions, clarifications, and has been enforced more and more. So it's an issue that's existed, but we've not felt the impact until recently. And it doesn't mean it's any less valid to address now in the past. But here's what you see in a government spec. So when I say government spec, we'll come back to this slide here in a second. There's some entities, government entities and acronyms that need to be defined, and I'll ask Peter to do so here in a minute. But really, this slide is just to show this is the context. This is where we're getting this NETA requirement. And if you make note, it's in the UFGS 01. That's not Division 26. That's 01. That's commissioning. So if we're going to take this apart, particularly the paragraph before, and use that as a context reference. To further elaborate this concern, it's not just what we interpret as the misapplication of an installer's criteria for a commissioning process. It's the misuse of the term commissioning. When we say misuse, ACG didn't coin the term commissioning, or what we learned today, commissioning process, that term. But it's how the client, from the client's perspective, how are they getting this misunderstanding? And we'll talk about that in a little bit more. So I do think it's beneficial to spend a minute to go over some of the acronyms and organizational relationships associated with this concern. Peter, I'll point this one to you. Are you okay going over? I know you can't see it that well, can you? Unfortunately.
I'm good.
Okay.
I'm good.
So I'll just lay out the players, and maybe you give us an overview, and we'll go into more detail afterwards. But we do want to be conservative of time for questions at the end. We have WBDG, the whole building design guide, NAVFAC, UFGS, Unified Facilities Guide specification, the clips we just showed, USACE, the Army Corps folks, and NIBS, National Institute of Building Science. Can you kind of outline the relationship like between the client to the spec to us with these entities?
So when Jesse gave me this slide, I was like, what did I do to deserve this? There's a lot of acronyms, and once you start digging through them, they all have a common denominator. And that common denominator is the Department of Defense. I believe it was 1918. They were started along with 5 other entities for the government, and they've evolved into different divisions. And I apologize, I'm reading, but there's a lot of history to this. I'm going to stand up as well. And they have originally initiated the United Facilities Criteria, UFC, another acronym. The program intent is great. It's to unify all construction, operation, and maintenance of property facilities, federal property facilities. The Department of Defense goal is to streamline the government criteria, which is great. But asking the government to streamline something, as we all know, doesn't happen, and it's very, cumbersome. Back to the acronyms: USACE, United States Army Corps of Engineers; NAVFAC, Naval Facilities Engineering Systems Command. They published the UFGS, Unified Facilities Guideline Specification. All these services operate under the Tri-Services Engineering Senior Executive Panel, another acronym, ESEP. And they also publish the UFGS. Then the Department of Defense participates in the management of these programs. UFC is a representative of the Engineer Senior Executive Panel. And like I said, they're all tied in together, which is okay, but it's hard keeping the players identified. it's just very difficult.
Or who's in what lane, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's all intertwined. And then when you take another step back at it, the WD or WBGDG, whole building design guide, the internet resource for reviewing the UFGS. The WDBG is managed by NIBS, National Institute of Building Science. So it's just very difficult trying to get an idea. And I was introduced to this specification requirement by going through a project and reading the specifications, what they wanted, and then all of a sudden I came across NETA certified electrical contractor. It's like for doing commissioning. But then when you start looking into what they're defining as commissioning, in my interpretation, it's startup and testing. It's not commissioning per se, because they're going through all the equipment, making sure its lugs are properly torqued, et cetera. All this limit switches are set in, they're correct. So it's not really commissioning per se. And then it ties all back in the name of the title, NETA, ANSI. Looking into ANSI, they're a nonprofit organization that oversees the development of standards locally and nationally. I first thought ANSI designed standards. They don't, they approve them. So it's like, well, all right, so it's another entity of the government, basically, and it's very cumbersome, basically, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a very detailed explanation. Thank you, Peter. So just to recap, your client, how will this affect you? You're chasing work, you're answering proposals, whether it's with the Army Corps, NAVFAC, maybe it's the same entity, but let's just say NAVFAC and USACE, your potential clients, pull specs from UFGS, and the WBDG is this website that houses that criteria, those standards. Is that a correct summary? And NIBS monitors the spec. That NIBS is a nonprofit organization.
Yeah, they're another nonprofit.
Okay.
And they look into the specs as well.
All right. So that's just kind of those are the players. Now we've got this spec. If that's not clear enough for you, sorry. It's when you do government work, you got to. This was beneficial to me to do this exercise. So hopefully this didn't confuse anybody. But whether you followed me to this point or followed us to this point, we have a spec with this requirement, and we're going to look at the text in context. And I apologize, this PowerPoint isn't the revised one, so we're going off an older one, but I think we're okay. So that if we're looking at this government requirement and we read what is required for the mechanical technical commissioning specialist, that requirement reads substantially different than the electrical. And I'd like, before we get into that difference, Jim, could you, when you read this mechanical commissioning specialist requirement, can you elaborate how we're okay with this but not the electrical? Like, what is the difference between the two? If we're okay with the mechanical specialist, why aren't we okay with the electrical?
Well, if you look at the mechanical specialist and compare that role to the test and balance role, let's say, okay, I think the mechanical specialist is a very generalized mechanical, services role. So you could have somebody who's familiar with the installation and operation of the system to do that, but he doesn't necessarily have to have any kind of a certification. And I think the distinction between the mechanical specialist and the electrical specialist comes down to special testing. Because in that mechanical specialist role, they're not asking for any type of special testing. They're just asking, for the system's work on the equipment. But when you get to the electrical side, you're talking about situations that require, maybe arc flash protection. Certainly you have to have the right electrical instrumentation and that. So I think what they may be trying to do with the NETA is to carve out electrical testing that is a parallel to the tab on the mechanical side. But I think they've not done a very good job of that. I think if they'd broken it out to an electrical specialist on parallel with the mechanical specialist and then added a NETA testing component to that, maybe that would get us to a little bit of a better place and define that work. And in the long run, it really, and you'll probably talk about this in a minute, comes down to the word commissioning and what commissioning means. When you're talking about all these different terms, mechanical specialist, electrical specialist, commissioning authority and all that, it all comes down to what do you think commissioning is? Is commissioning startup testing? Is commissioning a comprehensive process that begins at project initiation and ends at, operations? So I think that's really it. So does that answer your question?
It does. So Charles, we've got this requirement to satisfy this client expectation. Maybe we're wrong. Why don't we just get NETA certified? Why don't we hire somebody NETA certified? Why are we making a stink of this requirement? Why don't we just suck it up and get this requirement? Is that possible?
Yeah. So, the big thing is one, the independence. So, as a testing agency, a lot of times the whole point of commissioning is to give you that third party where so the whole part. Oh, you're good. Yeah, it just kind of jumped up out at me. It's like this. So the whole point of doing commissioning is to give that independent verification. So a lot of times the person that's doing the installation, the NETA tech or whatever is probably not the best person to commission his own work. So therefore, keeping that separate, and also just the requirement from commissioning, like Jim said, it's the process, it's the documentation, it's not just the testing, it's the the verification, it's the visits, it's not what just installing and verifying. It's also the testing, the verification, the reporting. So that aspect as well, and just as far as being able to review NETA documents. So like I said, there's still a place for it. And, that's something I know when we do specifications as far as quality control, that's something that we like to have everybody, insist and make sure that's done prior to us coming out there. But there still needs to be a delineation between, the actual NETA testing versus electrical commission.
Thank you. And Mark, could you elaborate on that? Charles did a great job with the function, how it's not practical, but is there any criteria preventing it, like physically, according to NETA, preventing it?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm all about, certifications and credentials and all that. So if we could get NETA certified, we would have. But if you look at the requirements, for your firm to be a NETA, if I get this right, NETA accredited firm, you have to spend, I think it's, 80% of your work has to be doing electrical testing. And that's really what we're talking about. It's the difference between commissioning and testing at its heart. But that's not what most commissioning firms or engineering firms who do commissioning, or those are electrical testing firms that can do 80% of their volume. And then your firm has to be accredited, and then to get your NETA certification levels 1, 2, 3, 4, it's really you're basically becoming an electrician. And if you look at the requirements,
8% of your work. Right?
Yeah.
So just to paraphrase that, to get the government wants you to be NETA certified to win this work. For you as a commissioning provider or anybody to achieve this certification, NETA's requirements are that you work for a NETA accredited company, and that company needs to have 80% of its revenue from NETA services. And that is MTS, ATS, essentially acceptance testing. And we're not, again, disparaging NETA. We're not saying it's not applicable or there's not a place for it. But to expect a commissioning provider to, who's familiar with NETA ATS or MTS testing? Just just has a rough idea. Let's say half the room. I wish I brought the books. Rebecca, you brought me the books and I left them in my room. What we're talking about is NETA ATS, acceptance test, is a book about that big, about 200-300 pages of, this component holds a charge. I bring in this large bank of capacitors and I discharge a current. I charge a capacitor, and then I'm testing insulation on this conductor. Maybe it's destructive testing. I am carting around large pieces of equipment that don't fit in the overhead, by the way, that are very heavy, that don't fit in my bag and TSA would have a problem with. And I am doing hands-on testing. So what company here, maybe this is the future. We look at commissioning providers. I would love for we started in the HVAC world, as Jim said, and we're electrically, if you look at the new guideline, we're progressing into additional electrical content. And maybe two people up here are excited about the electrical taking over, but we're getting there, right? But we're not there today. And will we ever be in a world where 80% of your proposals is asking for electrical commissioning and 20% is relegated to HVAC? I don't think there's going to be a commissioning provider that satisfies that 80% requirement. And there is some caveats. Again, we're talking about what it takes to be NETA certified. You need to work for the company, but there is you could leave a company, I think, and I apologize, I don't have a reference for this. My understanding is if I'm NETA certified, I can leave a NETA accredited company and go work. I have 5 years to go find another NETA accredited company while maintaining my certification. So we as providers why don't we poach NETA people, right? Because who wants to hire somebody with a 5-year minimum, assuming that's correct, a 5-year contract? And that's just another issue why we can't, as electrical commissioning folks, hire NETA certified people for what I believe is for any duration or a long-term solution. So it's not feasible. At least we've not found a way. I'm just going to say my experience, how we've satisfied this requirement, and it's not ideal. I wouldn't even call it a plan B. We find a NETA accredited company and they sub to us. Now, what we're doing in effect is paying somebody for their credentials. And if we take a look at the mechanical commissioning requirements, Jim, would you agree what you would consider inclusive? Like it's not to limit competition.
Right. I mean, the whole purpose is to do workforce development. I mean, the government has a vested interest in being able to hire people to perform the services that they vitally need on a project. And I don't think they would intentionally, it comes back to Peter and, you're talking about the convolution of different types of agencies going forward, and you end up with a result that maybe wasn't your intent, which I think is here. But it's clear to see, Jesse, how many NETA certified testers are there in the country versus the number of jobs? I mean, it's only a small percentage, and I think that's the answer. You can't do all the commissioning with just NETA certified people.
So, and then the next line of thought is, well, electrical commissioning, we're out of business, right? Maybe this electrical commissioning service that we advocate for, that I'm particularly fond of, that I imagine some of y'all appreciate, we're doing it wrong. Maybe NETA should be doing electrical commissioning. I'm wrong fairly often. Maybe I'm making a big stink of this. And maybe that's the solution. But again, I would argue that's not the case, what Jim just said. The workforce isn't there. Again, this has been an ongoing thing, an informal, just SSR's informal research. Maybe I can get to that slide quickly. You can go to NETA, and if you're a client or somebody looking for a NETA provider, they have a portal, and you can search for NETA accredited companies and individuals. Maybe it's just companies. But if you go to this website and you spend any time looking around, you'll quickly realize there's not representation in every state. So we ask the question, like if we are this not plan B trying to satisfy a client, the US government, with this NETA requirement is to sub out NETA folks, sub this work out, well, where are they, right? How do we get them on our team? And what the effect is to the contract is we're essentially ballooning the budget by 2, roughly speaking. And is that in the government's best interest? And we are trying to adhere to this criteria, not in our preferred means, but it essentially inflates what our cost is. Because the NETA folks we're subbing this work to can't do the commissioning work. And we are not certified to do the NETA work. Not that there is NETA work to do, it just needs to be NETA accredited. So we're in this case where we're subbing to this company, or to companies, and we're on the lookout for them. And if you go to NETA's website, again, SSR did an informal poll. We tried to find a representative for every state. I'm here to tell you there's not a NETA provider in Arkansas and at least one other state. But of the 50 so folks, companies we polled, and we asked very specific questions. Do you do NETA ECS commissioning? I started out saying NETA ATS is about that big, 200 to 300 pages. MTS is fairly similar. Again, a Division 26 installation, something we would advocate for. NETA ECS, electrical commissioning, is about a 60-page document, and 1 page deals with commissioning specific to a range of voltage of distribution equipment. And it reads more along the lines of manufacturer startup, really. And the rest of that 60-page NETA commissioning document describes a process, and I don't think poorly. I think they do a decent job describing the commissioning process. But it doesn't fit that place in my opinion, or our opinion, the government spec. So all I want to say is we polled people, we polled companies, 50 companies, about 1 for every state, and we asked them, do you do, not leading questions, do you do NETA ATS? NETA certified, you'd expect a yes. Some folks said no. Do you do NETA electrical commissioning? Of the 50 we asked, only 2 companies said yes. Only 2 companies knew what NETA electrical commissioning was. And then, again, this is an internal, informal poll SSR did. And it was simply to gauge how we can respond to clients, not to catch them in anything, but it was really eye-opening. And we can go into further questions with those 2 companies. It turns out only one of them even had a copy of it, and the other one was just, I think, kind of familiar with the terminology. But I'm going to back up. We kind of jumped ahead a little bit.
Jesse, I think it's worth reiterating just how big of a deal that is. So if I get this spec and I'm trying to comply with it, I've got to try to find a NETA certified company and technicians to be on the team. And then, as you said, that will ultimately balloon the budget by double. So if I'm reading the spec and trying to comply with it, the chances are that nobody else is. So my fee is going to be double. And then assuming you get the job, you're literally going to have and find a person that NETA certified technician is going to be standing next to you for most of the commissioning process while you go through commissioning, and then maybe they're doing the startup testing. It's a huge effort and a huge problem.
So that kind of, I hope, outlines the meat and potatoes of this concern, at least the initial portion of the concern, and that's this installer criteria being injected into commissioning requirements for one particular client, a big client, and the implications of that. The other is the use of the term commissioning. Like I said, we started out, the commissioning term's not trademarked. It doesn't belong to ACG. And who's to say that NETA and anybody else can't use this term commissioning? We just have to address, and Jim touched on this the previous hour, the terminology we use. You know, the installer is telling the owner they're doing commissioning. They've got this guideline that says this is electrical commissioning, when in fact it's startup. It has everything to do with the startup process. Doesn't belong in Division 01, doesn't belong in a commissioning spec. It's not part of the commissioning process. And that's the distinction. Commissioning startup, commissioning process. And how do we educate clients? How do we make this a better known entity throughout our industry? And I think this is a step. You know, we're sitting in a room. You know, half the folks here were aware of this spec, and the other half weren't. You are hopefully becoming privy to a concern that you can help your client, whether it's NAFAC, USACE, government, address in some meaningful way in the future. Maybe it's a question, because we'll get into some more government stuff in a little bit, describing entities. But maybe it's a government entity that's, an arm branch, a branch of service that has their own version of this, and they have the power to say, kind of like an AHJ, we want to adhere to this, but not that paragraph. And how do you go about having that conversation with the client? We'll talk about that in a little bit. We got about 13 minutes left. I want to save at least 10 minutes for Q&A. We can keep talking, but just any questions that raise your hand if you got a question you want to answer. Okay, we're going to talk for a couple. Oh, that's a bonus. Yeah. Thank you. There we go. So we're going to talk a little bit more, and then we'll save the last 15 minutes. So it's this term commissioning. So, kind of, the answer to this, but hopefully it'll incite some discussion. Does ASHRAE standards, any of them, any of the past guidelines, NAB, AEE recognize NETA certification requirements for CX providers or CX service for electrical or mechanical? Jim, have you ever seen that?
No.
Yeah, so we don't even need to turn the mic on for that. It's just like a resounding no. Nobody is saying you need to be NETA certified. You need to do NETA. That's a commissioning provider. I do want to. We'd had a few more hands as many hands as I was hoping for. So I'm kind of going to scroll down to the end. Most of these slides are just for reference, hopefully for some questions. So before we jump into any Q&A, are there any points, anything that speakers want to further clarify before we open up? No, it's not a trick question, yes or no?
I do, but I don't want to dominate the whole thing.
I think one of the biggest things that we stress as far as saving the government or just any of our clients is the financial impact that it brings apart. So to truly do it right, you would have to partner with a certified, NETA certified firm that, is familiar with the NETA portion, but still have to have the commissioning portion to do the full commissioning. Mm-hmm. And then we looked at out of the 50 firms, just in that small sample, there's only about 2. So just with that uncertainty, that increases the price as well. So I think, just as a benefit and understanding to the client is making sure we have it, our apples to apples, basically understanding exactly what they want and what they're getting. And that's something we constantly do in all aspects of commissioning.
You still need a waiver to do that, though, don't you? Because you're going to not be 80% of the work doing commissioning.
Can I say something real quick? Because I've dealt with this a lot.
Hang on a second, let me give you the microphone. You're in that.
Thanks, Jim. The problem we found is if you read that spec that you were showing, it says the commissioning agent must be NETA certified. So if I'm sitting there as a registered PE certified by 3 agencies to do commissioning, ASHRAE, ACG, and NEBB, And I'm looking at the Corps of Engineers lady who was eating my ass up one side and down the other, telling me I wasn't qualified to do the work because I wasn't NETA certified. I told her very bluntly, if I could be, I would be. You can't get there from here, and yet I have these credentials. And if I go hire a NETA certified electrician to perform the test that you have detailed in the spec for grounding and insulation and all the things that they detail, their distribution systems, infrared panel scans, all that stuff, he is not the commissioning agent. He's a certified electrician that has a NETA certification that is trade specific, designed to make a journeyman qualified to do the level of work that he's doing and test therein. He's knowledgeable enough to prove that the NFPA and NECC codes have been adhered to and that the quality of manufacturing for the components is meeting the UL standards and other things that are required. That's the whole purpose of this NETA stuff. It's to make sure the installation is safe and meets the industry standard for the job it's doing, which is clearing arc flashes if you have a fault or whatever, switch gear opening properly. I mean, on and on and on it goes. That's not a commissioning, like you said, that's not even necessarily startup. A lot of it's quality control and safety type inspections. So anyway, I asked her, I said, ma'am, I cannot meet the spec, and nobody I know in the country that is a certified commissioning specialist is NETA certified. So I can't even go hire you a person that meets your spec.
Amen.
So before we get into open questions, well said. Jim, these are Jim's words, that one of the distinctions here is testing. Jim, will you make a distinction between testing and commissioning?
Well, yeah, certainly. I mean, it comes down to a process and a specific act or element of that process. I mean, testing can be one of two things, really, mostly in our context. It's either going to be a diagnostic startup test where you're getting equipment ready to be operated and control, and then you have a process that makes sure that that element is done along with other checklists and manufacturer requirements, like Wes was talking about the UL characteristics and the machine operating quality. But that's just preparation to start it up and operate it so that you can then actually put in trending, look at your consumption, look at your meter performance and all that type of stuff. So it's a step in the commissioning process that is typically done by a contractor, but I don't call it commissioning. But when control contractors set up their controls, if you ever look at a temperature controls contract, you'll see that the owner is paying a controls contractor a certain amount of money for commissioning their systems, and that means doing point to point. And so like you say, the word commissioning can be applicable, but it has to be understood as part of the startup or the contractor commissioning. And in the controls area, we say contractor commissioning, as part of the controls, work.
So there's a bit of a disconnect here, right, between the folks developing the NETA standard, which is NETA World. I'm not making this up. It's called NETA World. And the people executing the NETA work, which is NETA certified individuals. So NETA World, develops the ATS, the MTS, and the NETA ECS. And NETA providers can get accredited and get their companies accredited. So we had a conversation with NETA World about a year ago. With at the time, the president, I haven't followed up since. The conversation didn't go well, so we're not exchanging Christmas cards. So I can't tell you what he's doing now. But I did go into it with an open heart, with honest questions, and I came away frustrated. And I think the next committee meeting we had, it was like, jump on a table. There's a problem. And the people developing these guidelines, these people, NETA's developing a guideline that their installers, that their technicians are having difficulty satisfying that criteria. So I do see that hand. We'll get to you in a second. So there is this disconnect. That conversation, the individual, Scott Blizzard, is not here today to represent himself or NETA World. I will just say some of the concerns I had that I brought up was, or were, you were selling an electrical commissioning service. How do you address design phase? If you look at this 60-page ECS standard, it tells you 59 pages of who wrote it, a couple pages for commissioning process, and then 1 page for electrical distribution equipment between 3 separate voltage ratings. That's it. That's it. And I asked the question, well, if somebody hires you to do a design review, is it a NETA certified technician doing a design review? And the answer to that question is yes. The NETA World president, for an hour, railed on me saying that there's people all over the world, drop the budget of NETA World, how much work they do, that they are in the position and currently doing entire whole building commissioning services. And I'm not just saying electrical. He went on to say that he was doing, NETA certified technicians are doing mechanical CX with this NETA electrical commissioning standard. So it was just this eye-opening thing, and it just kind of, I didn't know where to go from there. I never reached out to NETA World again. And what I want to do, we got a couple minutes, 15 minutes, quarter after. We're going to leave for questions, but I just want to spend a couple minutes to answer the question. We're up here complaining about it. What are we doing about it, right? So if you want to do something about it, and this is certainly what we followed, the government has a pathway for you to complain up, I guess you could say. Let's just call them CCRs. We have submitted ACG has submitted CCRs, and we're going to go over some of those responses. But you as an individual can do so here. CCR that was written is essentially this. NETA requirement doesn't belong there in the commissioning electrical spec. Solution, get this out of here. And the reason essentially is commissioning is not testing, right? This is installer requirements. I'm just paraphrasing for time right now, but you have these slides. So here we're going to get a little military branch stuff, so I apologize for kind of ignorant about this. Let's just say each branch in the military represented by USACE and NAVFAC. If I'm in the Air Force and I want to build a building on Air Force Base, I can as a .mil, .af, entity, I would go to what Peter did a good job describing, the UFGS spec, the government spec on WBDG. So the branches have this whole source, but they can customize their own, kind of this comment I made earlier, they can be local HJs and pick and choose. So this is a response we got from one of the branches, right? Army, or two of them, sorry. Army and Air Force, we received a response to the CCR regarding the possible path forward, and this individual represent two separate outcomes from Army.mil, Air Force.mil. They read our CCR and said, no, you got it wrong. This is going to stay in here for this reason, which is a really shot in the gut, right? Because what I think would happen was somebody in the government was like, well, we got mechanical commissioning. Let me Google electrical commissioning. And then NETA popped up. And they're like, cool, let's put that in there. What happens. And then now it's in the government tablet, and it's an act of Congress to remove it.
Literally.
So this is one response, not so positive, right? We did receive multiple responses. Here's one from the Navy, and I didn't serve, but apparently, are they Navy folks here? They're a little bit sharper than the rest. And their response was, you know what, you're right. And they changed it. So if you have a client that has usnavy.mil, they're pulling from this spec and it's not your concern. And this is all stemming from ACG putting forth effort. Now, So I'm going to highlight the branches just a little bit, and just to give you some context. Here is the response from the individual representing the Navy dot mil, and that's just to be clear. NAFAC Mid-Atlantic have been using a regional version of UFGS that includes these. So we're about at time. You have these slides. All this is I copy pasted this from an email that was provided to me, and this is what their response was from the Navy. I did not, again, old PowerPoint. Just to recap, Air Force, Army, and NASA are still using the old one, and Navy and Marine Corps are using this revised, so they do not have the NETA criteria in there. Okay. I can keep going. I have a bunch of slides, but if you're reading on this on your own, some of the confusion, I'll point this out. It's not a new topic. A bunch of folks have been discussing this for years. I've been asked to write an article on this, and quite honestly, it's already been written. I may do so again, but I don't think I'm going to add too much to it that's not already been developed. Mr. Renner wrote a very good paper on this topic, but the problem is there's chaff, there's false information. You just have to take it in context. So here's an article contrary to what I would write, what Mr. Renner wrote, and what we're talking about today, written by Mr. Hochberg. Mr. Hochberg happens to be one of the people that wrote the NETA ECS standard. So this is kind of where the confusion's going. The folks that are generating the content are also out confusing terminology, I think. And I don't think intentionally. I think they've got their industry's best interests. It just doesn't coincide with ours. So, here's that slide I was looking for, conveniently. But I think I did a good job without the slide. We got about 13 minutes for questions. Whoever raises their hands, okay, there we go.
Thank you. We've heard about how difficult it is to get a NETA person on our staff, but we have several projects today that commissioning providers are providing commissioning for projects that require this requirement. Mm-hmm. Can we take two scenarios, one like a 20,000 square feet and another 100,000 square feet building, how they are meeting this requirement or how they're providing commissioning on projects that has the spec requirement?
Mm-hmm. Maybe there's a different answer for everybody.
Just a discussion.
Yeah. Well, I think you can just pass it down. How SSR has done it is we've subbed out the NETA work, and it essentially inflates our budget. So is that answering your question?
That's a difficult thing to do. So is there any other way of getting it out for a small building, for a 20,000 square feet building?
Yep. So how
doing something different?
So, I'm sorry. The question is, but you had a mic, so I think everybody heard. How do we get around this? One is hire NETA folks, which is difficult to do. Another way that we've had some limited success is when you're bidding on this work, there's often a question period where you get a proposal. I'm not using the government terms, I apologize. You get a proposal, and then you can submit questions. And the questions are that you could submit, like, hey, we noticed you got this spec in here. We understand this to be not what you mean. And just,
Right.
whatever language you want to use, but just be upfront, like, hey, we can't satisfy this. We don't think this is what you mean. Can you confirm that? And we've had some success winning some work where the response, this is, years ago, like I said, this used to satisfy that client requirement. Not so much in the past few years. This is becoming an issue that's being upheld more. Okay.
Scott back here had the answer.
Yeah.
Go for it.
So we just got a contract where same thing came up where we had to go back to the USACE and request a variance. We put an RFV in for it. Mm-hmm. And then we had to give them a letter saying, here's what our approach is going to be. And we worked out a relationship with the electrical contractor in the area. Because again, we're back to the budgetary thing and about scheduling. And once we showed them that approach, so far it's worked for us at this time. But that's, again, once we were awarded the project, then they came up and they said, oh, by the way, so we had to do what's called an RFV, request for variance.
That's a good solution. Okay, I saw several hands. Oh, there we go. I'm going to just stop asking. Just raise your hands. We get a mic in it.
I travel the world. I do commissioning. I do a lot of military work. I do a lot of standby generator work. When you see the common term commissioning and you see NETA in front of it, do not pursue it. You're not qualified.
Yeah.
Maybe you'd like to put your hands on a 13,840 volt system, but realize those medium voltage systems kill. And they kill people every year. And why is NETA so profoundly strong about their test requirements? Is because OSHA is on their tail because there are hundreds, if not thousands of people killed every year dealing with medium voltage switchgear. There's a popular YouTube video that shows a guy at a power station and he's racking out a breaker, and a security camera sees a flash, which is an arc flash, and even his boots were vaporized.
So that's a good point. Liability.
Yeah, and NETA testing agencies. Okay, so let's say you're a commissioner and your team pulls up in a van. How many dollars do you have in test equipment in that van? 1,000, 2,000, 5,000? A NETA testing agency typically has $1 million. I was just working last week on a site. A guy pulled out this thing that looked like a suitcase. $250,000 was its cost. And we analyzed a transformer. So you may be familiar with the term commissioning, but if you see that term preceded by NETA, don't pursue the work.
So, good point. One thing we want to emphasize is NETA has a place in the industry, not necessarily what I want to do, but NETA does have value I would argue has value to the owner. I'm not going to argue it to you. I'd argue to an owner. NETA does have value. NETA ATS testing, MTS, and it's applicable if you're qualified. And I think that's what their levels of certification bring them. It's not an industry. I don't want to be NETA certified. I don't want to do that. And your point's well taken. And that brings up something that we didn't really address is insurance. You know, a lot of us work for design firms. Who here knows the lawyer in their firm and thinks they know what they say when they tell them, oh yeah, I'm going to be touching something on a job site. You know, like our insurance is for that of a consultant, right? Not necessarily somebody with $1 million of equipment working with hands-on medium voltage. So that's a point well taken. I'm gonna keep going. Here we go. Yep.
So let's say that we do want to.
Thanks.
All right, so let's say that we do want to get all the NETA certifications, obviously taking it a little bit down the road as far as liabilities and things like that, all things being equal. Is the actual NETA requirement that you have to have in dollar amount 80% of your revenue, or is it something where you have to have 80% of your projects that have electrical testing in them?
It's revenue.
And I'm fairly certain it's 80%.
It is. Yeah.
I'm fairly confident. This came from a conversation with Mr. Blizzard and subsequent conversations with others, but I can't find that on their website, but I'm pretty sure it's 80%. If it's not 80, it's 70%, the majority of your work.
Yeah, so I was a former NETA right here in the front. To your right, down here, right.
There we go.
Right here. So I was a NETA certified technician and am a building commissioning professional now. And just comments about...
Pass out your cards.
Say again?
Pass out your business cards.
Yeah. Open for business. Starting a NETA testing company in about a month. So come hit me up. But anyway, just a few things just a comment, since I kind of am from that side. It is 80% revenue from starting NETA testing companies. It is 80% revenue. And the difference, I did see up there, you had highlighted from the acceptance testing standard that you have to be a certified technician per the ETT standards. That isn't carried in the ECS standard. It does not require NETA certification. NETA doesn't even require NETA certification to follow the ECS guidelines. So that's one way that you can get around it is it's more of an ANSI guideline that NETA took over. So what you had up there was the ATS.
That's an important distinction.
Standard.
There's two things we're talking about. We've been talking about the specification specifically, which requires NETA certified technicians. But the ECS, you're right, it doesn't say specifically that. It's more about the process that happens to include startup.
Yeah, and then there was another comment, and it was about the independence of the NETA company, and they are a third-party company. So in a lot of data centers that I've commissioned, we weren't a NETA testing company, but we were the commissioning agent, and we also were the electrical testing provider too. So there's a lot of wordsmithing that you can do and discussions that you can have with your customers, but to kind of separate those is kind of bridging the gap between the electrical contractor and the commissioning provider is the electrical testing person. So just some clarifications.
Appreciate it. And to summarize your comments, which are insightful, you maybe keep the mic there. You may want to counter. So that this government requirement says NETA certification. You're making the argument that the person can do NETA ECS and forego the NETA certification?
I'm just saying that the ECS does not require, it just requires qualified personnel in the work. So it doesn't, the NETA ECS does not require NETA certification.
All right. And so this is a clip from the latest NETA ECS. These specifications describe the systematic process of documenting. I'm going to kind of paraphrase down here. This document shall be used in conjunction with the most recent edition of NETA standard. That's ATS, the individual electrical components, blah, blah. If I were to open up NETA ATS, would there be a requirement to be NETA certified?
Yes.
So by chain of custody, NETA ECS is referencing you need to use NETA ATS. And I go to NETA ATS.
Yeah, I think I have the old ECS downloaded. I was just reading through it and I was like, I don't see it, but yeah, I might have the old ECS.
It does say
the original
2000.
one from 2000, yeah, it does not have a requirement. So maybe that reference would negate that.
It's just reference too.
Yeah, so NETA ECS has no level of NETA certification mentioned, and Scott Blizzard went on to at least say that much. So that you can do NETA ECS work, and like the gentleman said, not be NETA certified, but it's just peculiar to put out a standard with no qualifications. But it brings us, big picture, the government is looking for NETA accredited individuals, and that's the concern. Whether we're doing NETA ECS or ATS or MTS, how we address that is varied with some success. We're getting close. There are more hands, so more questions. Did we answer all the questions? There you go.
So, and taking the point with the safety and the equipment that's required, but isn't this similar to the requirement of having an AABC certified group working under the commissioning, just like the NETA certified working under the electrical commissioning? And how would that be different?
So, Jim, I'd like to kick this one to you, but you're essentially asking like a tab versus NETA.
Correct, yes.
It could work that way, but the problem isn't necessarily NETA, it's the actual WBDG specs.
Right.
And the specs themselves say that the electrical specialist has to be a NETA certified. And that's where you get into the rub of the 80% and so forth.
Granted, and it could have been the same thing on the mechanical side if they had said it has to be AABC certified to do all the building commissioning.
That's right, and you know too that the typical tab paradigm is as a sub to the contractor. I know AABC would much rather go direct to owner like we advocate on the commissioning side. But in reality, the majority of tab agencies are hired by the mechanical contractor, and I don't see why NETA testing couldn't be the same way, where the electrical contractor subcontracts the NETA testing, and then you do a commissioning process just like we do on the mechanical. They're two different things. One's electrical acceptance testing for the installation, and the other one is commissioning.
And to that point, we've done as a group, almost 2,000 commissioning projects. Probably about half of them had some type of NETA requirement associated with it, and whether it was directly to the electrical contractor or to the GC, those that we did, because NETA does provide a terrific and much needed process in getting the building accepted.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and all this came out of when we were doing specification review from the WBDG as part of the Guideline Committee, because we were looking to write guidelines. And so this is a really good example of, trying to do some market transformation here, because it's more an issue of just getting it misconfigured. I think no one in this room, or at least none of us up here at the podium, are advocating for wanting to do NETA testing, or that NETA testing doesn't need to be done. We're just saying it's not being put into the proper niche right now.
Right.
And it's doing it at the expense of commissioning, so you're sacrificing an important component of your overall construction.
Well said.
We're approaching time, but I do see your hand up, sir.
My understanding is we can keep going. It just is going into lunchtime, and then whoever wants to just hang around is fine.
Well, you have to stay. You can't go to lunch. We're going to keep talking about this.
I just want to answer his question. Why, when you can have tab and commissioning of the mechanical system, why not have the NETA testing and the other electrical lighting, control, those kind of tests? Why don't you have that? It's OSHA requirements. If you get into the NETA testing manual and you're an entry-level technician and you take the test, I would say 60% of the test is your knowledge of OSHA requirements regarding energized circuits. And the whole thing on NETA testing is safety, because you're dealing with dangerous stuff. As a mechanical commissioner, I deal with 24-volt stuff, lighting 277 single phase. These are things that, you got to be cautious. But racking out a breaker on a medium voltage system requires, based on the sizing of that switchgear, what category of calorie suit you wear. And that calorie suit is you put on coveralls, you put on a coat, and this is heavy stuff, and you put on a face shield that is securely sealed up. You put on rubber gloves, and you put leather gloves over that. And so this is just to rack out switchgear, which is a guy walks over and he turns a little crank. And it's potentially life-threatening work. And that's why NETA testing should remain NETA testing. And I agree with everybody up there that commissioning is the wrong term. Commissioning is what we do. NETA does testing of electrical switchgear. And we're not talking about 120 volt minor distribution. We're talking about 480 volt and above, which is deadly equipment.
Point well taken.
Well said.
So We're a little over time. We'll stay up here, answer questions, but don't let us hold you from lunch.
Next session's at
Hopefully this
2:15.
was interesting to some degree. Mark, would you have?